Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Through Ages. Tonight we're looking at the long night at the Rubicon. Caesar's decision, often remembered as a bold act of ego and ambition, but better understood as a systemic failure of the Roman legal framework to resolve a deadlock between two competing military and political powers. The Rubicon was not, by any geographical standard, a significant river. It was a shallow, narrow stream in northern Italy, winding its way toward the Adriatic Sea. In the winter of 49 BC, it likely appeared as little more than a muddy trickle through the landscape. However, its importance was entirely artificial, defined not by the volume of its water, but by the weight of Roman law. Under the statutes of the Republic, this stream served as the official boundary between the province of Cisalpine Gaul and the Sacred Heart of Italy. For a Roman general, crossing this line while leading an army was an act of treason that could not be undone. It was the point where provincial authority ended and the jurisdiction of the city-state began. To cross it with a legion was to declare that the law no longer applied to the person leading those soldiers. At first glance, the decision to cross seems like a sudden moment of high drama, but it was actually the culmination of several years of mounting institutional pressure. Gaius Julius Caesar had spent the previous decade in Gaul, conducting a series of campaigns that had expanded the borders of the Republic to the Rhine and the Atlantic. These wars had provided him with immense wealth, but more importantly, they had forged a deep personal bond between him and his soldiers. In the Roman system, a general's power was proportional to the loyalty of his men. By 50 BC, Caesar's legions were no longer just soldiers of the state. They were professional veterans whose livelihoods and future pensions depended entirely on Caesar's success. This created a tension that the Senate in Rome was increasingly unable to manage. What matters here is the legal trap Caesar found himself in as his command drew to a close. According to Roman law, a magistrate was immune from prosecution while he held official office, or imperium. Caesar's command in Gaul provided this protection, but as soon as he stepped down and became a private citizen, his political enemies were waiting to bring him to trial. These enemies, led by the conservative faction known as the Optimates, intended to charge him with various legal irregularities during his previous consulship. For Caesar, returning to Rome without the protection of an office meant certain political ruin and possible exile. The struggle at the Rubicon was, in a very practical sense, an attempt by an individual to avoid a legal system that had been weaponized against him. By this point, the political landscape of Rome had shifted significantly due to the collapse of the first triumvirate. In the earlier years of the decade, Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Crassus had maintained a delicate balance of power. But the death of Crassus in a military campaign in the east and the death of Caesar's daughter, Julia, who was also Pompey's wife, had removed the personal and political ties that held the alliance together. Pompey, once Caesar's partner, had gradually moved toward the Optimates. He was increasingly seen by the Senate as the only man capable of providing a military counterweight to Caesar's growing influence. This set the stage for a binary conflict where neither side felt they could afford to back down without losing everything. One of the reasons this situation became so intractable was the issue of standing for the consulship in absentia. Caesar wanted to transition directly from his provincial command to a new consulship in Rome. If he could do this, his legal immunity would remain intact. A law had even been passed by the 10 tribunes allowing him this privilege. However, the Senate, pushed by Cato the Younger, began to place bureaucratic obstacles in his path. They demanded that he resign his command and return to the city as a private citizen before he could even be considered for election. From Caesar's perspective, this was a demand for unconditional surrender. From the Senate's perspective, it was a necessary reassertion of civilian control over a runaway general. The problem with this situation was that both sides had legitimate grievances rooted in the failure of the Republican Constitution. The Republic was designed for a small city-state, not a massive empire with permanent professional armies. There was no mechanism for a peaceful transition of power when a general became more powerful than the state itself. Throughout the year 50 BC, a series of diplomatic attempts were made to find a middle ground. A tribune named Gaius Scribonius Curio proposed that both Caesar and Pompey should lay down their commands simultaneously. This was a logical solution that would have removed the threat of civil war, and when it was put to a vote in the Senate, it passed by a staggering margin of 370 to 22. This shows that the vast majority of the Roman political class wanted peace. However, the small but determined minority of optimates managed to block the implementation of this vote. They convinced the consuls that Caesar was already marching on Rome, which was untrue at the time, and they gave Pompey the authority to raise an army to defend the city. This move effectively bypassed the democratic will of the Senate and placed the state on a war footing. For Caesar, who was stationed in Ravenna just north of the Rubicon, this was the final signal that diplomacy had failed. He realized that the extremists in Rome had successfully maneuvered Pompey into a position where he had to fight. The systemic constraints of the Roman government had been exploited to create a conflict that the majority of participants didn't actually want. By late December of 50 BC, the tension reached a breaking point. The Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree of emergency, which stripped Caesar of his command and declared him an enemy of the state if he did not disband his army. The tribunes Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius Longinus, who had used their veto power to protect Caesar's interests, were threatened with violence and fled the city in disguise. They arrived at Caesar's camp in Ravenna, providing him with the perfect rhetorical justification for war. He could now claim that he was not fighting for his own ambition, but to defend the sacred rights of the tribunes and the traditional liberties of the Roman people. One of the reasons the timing of this decision was so critical was the military logistics of the winter season. Caesar only had one legion, the 13th, with him in Ravenna. The rest of his veteran troops were still in Gaul, weeks away from Italy. If he waited for his full army to arrive, he would give Pompey and the Senate time to mobilize the vast resources of the empire against him. Crossing the Rubicon with a single legion was a massive risk, but it offered the advantage of surprise. He hoped that by moving quickly, he could paralyze the government in Rome and force a new round of negotiations before the situation spiraled into a full-scale war. It was a gamble based on speed and psychological impact. At first glance, the night of January 10th, 49 BC, appeared to be a normal evening at Caesar's headquarters. He attended a public banquet and behaved with his usual calm and sociability. He even made a point of discussing the plans for a new gladiatorial school he intended to build. This was a calculated piece of performance, intended to keep his intentions secret until the very last moment. Only a small inner circle of officers knew that the order had already been given for the 13th Legion to move toward the river. As the night progressed, Caesar quietly slipped away from the party, borrowing a carriage pulled by mules from a nearby bakery to avoid drawing attention. The journey from Ravenna to the Rubicon was a period of intense private reflection for a man who was usually characterized by his decisiveness. Historical accounts, such as those by Suetonius and Plutarch, suggest that Caesar paused at the bank of the river, debating the consequences of his actions. He reportedly told his companions that if they refrained from crossing, they would face misery, but if they crossed, they would bring misery upon the whole world. This moment of hesitation is significant because it highlights the weight of the tradition Caesar was about to break. He was a man of the Roman elite, deeply aware of the history and the sanctity of the laws he was about to violate. He knew that once he crossed, there was no returning to the old world. The logic-driven nature of Caesar's final choice is often obscured by the famous phrase, "the die is cast." In reality, the decision was a cold assessment of the incentives available to him. He could choose certain political and personal destruction in Rome, or he could choose the risk of civil war with a high probability of victory. For a man of Caesar's temperament and history, the choice was almost predetermined by the actions of his enemies. They had removed every other path for his survival. By crossing the river, he was simply moving the conflict from a legal arena where he was weak to a military arena where he was strong. He was choosing the battlefield that favored his specific talents and resources. By this point, the 13th Legion was already wading through the shallow water of the Rubicon. These were men who had served with Caesar for years, through the winters of Gaul and the crossing of the Rhine. To them, the legal boundaries of Italy were less important than the command of their general. The professionalization of the Roman army meant that the soldiers' primary loyalty was to the man who paid them and led them to victory, not to the abstract laws of a senate hundreds of miles away. This was the ultimate systemic failure. The state had allowed its military force to become a private tool of its commanders. When Caesar stepped into the water, he was merely the physical embodiment of a shift in power that had been occurring for decades. One of the reasons this moment remains so fixed in history is that it marked the end of the deliberative process of the Republic. For centuries, Roman politics had been a matter of voting, speaking, and legal maneuvering. While there had been instances of violence, the idea of the law as the ultimate arbiter had remained intact. Caesar's crossing changed the currency of power. From January 49 BC onward, the primary question in Roman politics was no longer, "What does the law say?" but "How many legions do you have?" The crossing was the point of no return for an entire system of government. As Caesar reached the southern bank, the long night of decision ended, and the reality of a new, military-driven era began to take shape in the cold morning light. The quiet conclusion of this first part of our look at Caesar's decision is the realization that the Rubicon was not just a river, but a threshold between two ways of existing. Behind him lay the Republic, with its complex rules and frustrating deadlocks. Ahead of him lay a world where his will was the law. As he began the march toward Ariminum, the first city on the road to Rome, Caesar was no longer a servant of the state, he was its challenger. The decision had been made, the constraints of the old system had been broken, and the long, slow process of the Republic's transformation into an empire had entered its most violent and decisive phase. The news that Caesar had crossed the Rubicon and occupied the town of Ariminum reached Rome like a physical shock, triggering a systemic collapse of the city's political nerves. At first glance, the panic seems disproportionate. Caesar had only one legion with him, while Pompey had the legal authority to call upon the vast resources of the entire empire. However, the problem with this situation was the logistical reality of mobilization. Pompey's veteran troops were mostly in Spain, and the new levies he was raising in Italy were raw, unorganized, and lacked the cohesion of Caesar's hardened 13th. In the Roman system, speed was often a more valuable asset than total numbers. By moving in the dead of winter, a time when military operations usually ceased, Caesar had invalidated all of the Senate's defensive assumptions. What matters here is the psychological vacuum that opened within the leadership of the Optimates. For months, men like Cato and the consuls had acted as if their legal decrees would be enough to stop Caesar. They had assumed that he would follow the traditional protocols of a Roman aristocrat, even as they stripped him of his dignity and safety. When the reality of his march became undeniable, the lack of a practical defensive plan was exposed. Pompey, realizing that he could not hold Rome with the forces currently at his disposal, made the controversial decision to abandon the city. This was not a move of cowardice, but a cold assessment of the constraints of the terrain. He believed that the only way to win a long-term war against a general as capable as Caesar was to withdraw to Greece, consolidate his superior resources, and eventually return with an overwhelming force. One of the reasons this evacuation was so chaotic was the lack of clear instructions for the civilian government. Pompey declared that any senator who remained in Rome would be treated as a traitor to the Republic. This created a profound dilemma for the Roman elite. They were being asked to leave their homes, their ancestral estates, and the sacred heart of their religion to follow a general into the unknown. The scene in the city was one of hurried confusion. Families packed what they could carry into wagons, and the treasury was left behind in the frantic rush to exit through the southern gates. This was the moment when the institutional continuity of the Republic was physically broken. The Senate was no longer a body that governed from the Curia. It had become a government in exile, its authority now entirely dependent on Pompey's military success. By this point, Caesar was moving down the Adriatic coast with a velocity that the Romans called celeritas. He was not just marching, he was conducting a series of rapid negotiations with the towns in his path. Most of these municipalities, seeing the speed of his advance and the retreat of the senatorial forces, chose to open their gates rather than risk a siege. Caesar's policy of clementia, or mercy, was a brilliant piece of political logistics. He forbade his soldiers from looting and released any captured enemy officers without ransom. This was a deliberate reversal of the bloody precedents set by Sulla a generation earlier. By acting as a restorer of peace rather than a vengeful conqueror, Caesar was lowering the cost of surrender for his fellow Romans. He was winning the war of public opinion as effectively as he was winning the war of maneuver. One of the reasons the town of Corfinium became a critical bottleneck in this early stage was the stubbornness of Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. Domitius was a staunch aristocrat who had been appointed by the Senate to replace Caesar as governor of Gaul. Unlike Pompey, who wanted to consolidate his forces, Domitius decided to make a stand at Corfinium with about 30 cohorts of newly raised troops. This created a systemic conflict within the anti-Caesarian camp. Pompey wrote several letters to Domitius, pleading with him to abandon the town and join the main army at Brundisium. Domitius ignored these orders, believing that he could stop Caesar's momentum through sheer defiance. This lack of a unified command structure was one of the primary reasons the senatorial defense of Italy failed so spectacularly. The siege of Corfinium lasted only a week, but it served as a proof of concept for Caesar's new style of warfare. He surrounded the town with earthworks and waited for the internal pressures of the situation to do his work for him. The soldiers inside Corfinium, realizing that Pompey was not coming to save them and impressed by Caesar's reputation, eventually mutinied against Domitius. They arrested their own commander and handed him over to Caesar, along with the keys to the city. Caesar's response was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He pardoned Domitius and allowed him to leave with his personal fortune intact, while incorporating the 30 cohorts of soldiers into his own army. The logic was simple. Every soldier he spared was a soldier he didn't have to fight later, and a soldier he could potentially use for his own ends. By late February, the focus of the entire Mediterranean world had shifted to the port of Brundisium, located at the heel of the Italian boot. This was the only place left where Pompey could escape to the east. Caesar arrived at the gates of the city with 6 legions, having picked up reinforcements along his march. He realized that if he could trap Pompey in the harbor, he could end the war in a single stroke. He began a massive engineering project, attempting to block the mouth of the harbor with a series of moles and floating rafts. This was a display of the Roman military's capacity for large-scale logistics and construction, a skill Caesar had honed during his years in Gaul. He was attempting to use the landscape itself as a prison for his rival. The problem with this situation was that Pompey was also a master of logistics, particularly on the sea. He used his superior naval forces to keep the harbor open just long enough for his transports to load his remaining legions, the consuls, and the senators. In a series of nighttime maneuvers, while Caesar's engineers worked frantically nearby, Pompey successfully evacuated his entire force across the Adriatic to Dyrrhachium. It was a tactical victory for Pompey, as it preserved the core of his army and the legal legitimacy of the Senate. However, it was a strategic catastrophe for the defense of Italy. In just 60 days, Caesar had conquered the entire peninsula without losing a single major battle. He had become the master of the Roman heartland, but he was a master without a fleet. At first glance, Caesar's position in Rome looked triumphant, but he faced a significant systemic crisis of legitimacy. He arrived at the city gates in late March, but he found a capital that was empty of its traditional leaders. The Senate was gone, the treasury was locked until he broke it open, and the legal machinery of the state was paralyzed. He attempted to convene a meeting of the remaining senators, but many were too frightened to attend. One of the reasons he was so frustrated during this time was the refusal of men like Cicero to support his cause. Cicero, though he disliked Pompey's retreat, could not bring himself to legitimize an armed invasion of Italy. Caesar found that while he could control the city through force, he could not yet control the narrative of his own authority. What matters here is how Caesar addressed the problem of a two-front war. Pompey was in the east, building a massive army, but Pompey's most loyal and veteran legions were still in Spain, under the command of his lieutenants. Caesar realized that if he followed Pompey across the sea immediately, he would be caught between Pompey's fleet in the Adriatic and his legions in the west. This was a classic strategic constraint. He famously remarked, "I am going to meet an army without a general, and then I shall return to meet a general without an army." He decided to delay his pursuit of Pompey and instead march his legions across the Alps into Spain to neutralize the veteran threat at his back. One of the reasons the Spanish campaign was so difficult was the nature of the terrain and the supply lines. Caesar faced 2 of Pompey's most capable legates, Afranius and Petreius, at the town of Iloda. For weeks, the 2 armies engaged in a war of position and maneuver, with Caesar's forces nearly being destroyed by a sudden flood that cut off their supplies. It was not a war of grand battles, but a war of starvation and psychological pressure. Caesar used his soldiers' engineering skills to divert the course of a river, eventually trapping the Pompeians in a position where they had no water. Once again, he avoided a massacre. He allowed the enemy legions to disband and go home, further reinforcing his reputation for clementia. By this point, the political mood in Rome had begun to stabilize, albeit under the shadow of the sword. In Caesar's absence, his lieutenants had managed to maintain order and even conduct some basic administrative functions. When Caesar returned from Spain in late 49 BC, he was finally appointed as dictator, a move that provided him with a temporary legal framework for his power. He only held the office for 11 days, long enough to oversee his own election as consul for the following year, and to pass several necessary economic reforms to address the debt crisis that had been exacerbated by the war. This was the logic of a man who still wanted to be seen as working within the Roman tradition, even as he was fundamentally rewriting its rules. The quiet observation that ends this part of the story is the realization that the Civil War was no longer a struggle for the city of Rome, but a struggle for the entire Mediterranean. Caesar had secured the West, but Pompey had secured the East, with its vast wealth, its legendary grain supplies, and its superior naval power. Italy was now merely the center of an empire that was divided against itself. As the year 49 BC came to a close, Caesar stood on the shores of Brundisium, looking out across the winter seas toward Greece. He had crossed the Rubicon, he had conquered Italy, and he had neutralized Spain, but the ultimate test of his decision still lay ahead of him on the other side of the water. One of the reasons the next phase of the war would be so different was the shift in scale. The conflict was moving away from the familiar roads and towns of Italy into the rugged mountains of Epirus and the vast plains of Thessaly. The stakes were no longer just Caesar's career or a few legal charges. The stakes were the survival of the republican system itself. The long night at the Rubicon had led to a long morning of war, and as Caesar prepared his men for the dangerous sea crossing, the calm, sincere reality of his gamble was becoming clearer with every passing day. The logic of the sword had been drawn, and now it had to be followed to its inevitable final conclusion. The winter of 48 BC presented Julius Caesar with a logistical challenge that many of his contemporaries considered insurmountable. Pompey the Great controlled the Adriatic Sea with a massive fleet of over 500 warships, commanded by Caesar's old rival, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus. Under the traditional rules of ancient warfare, naval operations ceased during the winter months due to the extreme unpredictability of the weather and the difficulty of keeping ships supplied in rough seas. Pompey's strategy was based on this seasonal constraint. He believed that Caesar would be trapped in Italy until the spring, giving the senatorial forces ample time to finish their massive mobilization in Macedonia. However, Caesar understood that his primary advantage was the very speed and recklessness that his opponents deemed impossible. He realized that waiting for the spring would allow Pompey to become too strong to defeat. What matters here is the sheer audacity of the sea crossing that Caesar attempted in early January. He gathered 7 legions at Brundisium, but he lacked enough transport ships to move them all at once. Furthermore, he had no warships to protect his transports from Bibulus's patrols. At first glance, the move was a suicide mission. But Caesar calculated that the winter gales, while dangerous, would also keep the Pompeian fleet in their harbors. On the night of January 4th, he set sail with about 20,000 men and 600 cavalry. The crossing was successful, largely because the Pompeian scouts did not believe any general would be mad enough to attempt it. Caesar landed at Palest, on the rugged coast of Epirus, and immediately sent his empty transports back to Italy to fetch the rest of his army. One of the reasons this initial success quickly turned into a crisis was the efficiency of the Pompeian response. Bibulus, furious at being bypassed, finally put his fleet to sea and captured 30 of Caesar's returning transports, burning them with their crews still on board. This left Caesar stranded in Greece with only half his army, facing Pompey's full force of nearly 50,000 men. For several months, the war became a game of high-stakes positioning along the Apsus River. Caesar was caught in a classic logistical vice. He could not advance against Pompey's superior numbers, and he could not retreat because the sea was blocked behind him. This period of the campaign is often misunderstood as a stalemate, but it was actually a test of which system could endure the most pressure. Caesar lived exactly as his soldiers did, eating the same meager rations and sleeping in the same conditions, which maintained the morale of his men despite their isolation. By this point, the pressure on the other half of Caesar's army, still in Italy under the command of Mark Antony, was reaching its limit. Caesar was so desperate for reinforcements that he allegedly attempted to cross the Adriatic back to Italy in a small rowboat during a storm, disguised as a slave. When the terrified pilot wanted to turn back, Caesar reportedly told him, "Fear not, you carry Caesar and his fortune." While this story may be embellished by later historians, it reflects the genuine systemic desperation of his situation. Eventually, in April, Antony managed to find a gap in the blockade and landed the remaining 4 legions at Nymphium, north of Pompey's position. Through a series of rapid marches, the two halves of Caesar's army united, finally giving him the strength to take the offensive. The problem with this situation was that Pompey was not interested in a pitched battle. He knew that Caesar's veterans were the best infantry in the world, and he also knew that Caesar's supply lines were non-existent. Pompey's strategy was to win through attrition. He withdrew to the coastal city of Dyrrhachium, a naturally fortified position with a large harbor that allowed him to be supplied by sea. Caesar, in an unprecedented move for a general with fewer troops, attempted to besiege Pompey by building a massive line of circumvallation, a continuous wall 18 miles long, to pin Pompey against the sea. This led to a surreal landscape of warfare, where the besieger was actually more starved for food than the besieged. Caesar's men were forced to eat chara, a bread made from wild roots, which they mockingly threw at the Pompeians to show their refusal to surrender. One of the reasons the standoff at Dyrrhachium eventually broke was a tactical error in Caesar's fortifications. A pair of Gallic chieftains deserted to Pompey and informed him of a weak point in the southern end of Caesar's wall, where it met the sea but had not been completed on the inner side. Pompey launched a sophisticated combined land and sea assault on this point, overwhelming Caesar's defenders. In the chaotic battle that followed, Caesar's army suffered its first major defeat of the civil war. Nearly 1,000 of his men were killed, and his army was thrown into a panicked retreat. At first glance, this should have been the end of Julius Caesar. Pompey, however, did not follow up his victory with a decisive pursuit, fearing an ambush in the broken terrain. Caesar famously remarked, "Today the victory would have been with the enemy if they had a general who knew how to take it." The retreat from Dyrrhachium into the interior of Greece was a period of intense systemic reorganization for Caesar. He had lost his momentum, his fortifications, and many of his men. He realized that staying on the coast was no longer viable. He decided to march into the fertile plains of Thessaly, hoping to find food and perhaps force Pompey into a battle far away from the sea. This move was a gamble of redirection. If Pompey followed him, the war would be decided on land, where Caesar felt most confident. If Pompey instead returned to Italy to reclaim the capital, Caesar would lose the political heart of the Republic, but would at least have a chance to regroup. Pompey, pressured by the senators in his camp, who were eager for a final victory, chose to follow Caesar. What matters here is the atmosphere inside Pompey's camp during the march toward Thessaly. The senators and aristocrats who accompanied Pompey were not professional soldiers. They were politicians who viewed the war as a personal inconvenience. They were already arguing over who would inherit Caesar's properties and who would be appointed to various offices once the war was over. They criticized Pompey for his cautiousness, calling him Agamemnon and King of Kings, implying that he was prolonging the war just to keep his command. This political pressure forced Pompey's hand. He was a general who understood the logistical benefits of delay, but he was also a man who depended on the legal and social approval of the elite. The systemic failure of the senatorial camp was its inability to maintain military discipline among its highest-ranking members. One of the reasons the plain of Pharsalus became the site of the final encounter was its suitability for the massive scale of the armies involved. Pompey had over 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, while Caesar had only 22,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry. Pompey's plan was simple and logically sound. He would use his overwhelming cavalry to outflank Caesar's right wing and roll up his line from the side. Caesar, anticipating this move, created a fourth line of 6 elite cohorts hidden behind his cavalry. He instructed these men not to throw their javelins, but to use them as pikes, aiming for the faces of the young Pompeian aristocrats in the cavalry, who he believed would be more concerned with their looks than their duty. By this point, the tension between the two armies had reached a point where even the soldiers felt the weight of the historical moment. These were Romans fighting Romans, often brothers or cousins facing each other across the field. Caesar ordered his men to spare the citizens once the battle was won, but the initial clash was brutal and direct. When Pompey's cavalry charged, Caesar's hidden fourth line stepped forward and executed their orders with disciplined precision. The Pompeian cavalry, surprised by the ferocity and the unusual tactics of the infantry, broke and fled the field in a disorganized mass. This left Pompey's left flank completely exposed. Caesar's fourth line then wheeled around and attacked the Pompeian infantry from the side and rear. The problem with this situation for Pompey was the speed with which his numerical advantage evaporated once his cavalry was gone. His raw recruits, seeing their elite horsemen flee, began to lose heart. Caesar then ordered his third, fresh line of veterans into the fray. The Pompeian line collapsed. Pompey, seeing the destruction of his army from a distance, reportedly fell into a state of shock. He returned to his tent, removed his general's cloak, and fled toward the coast. The battle was a total systemic victory for Caesar. He had not only defeated the army of the Senate, he had broken the prestige of the man who had been the Republic's greatest champion for 30 years. One of the reasons the aftermath of Pharsalus was so significant was Caesar's treatment of the captured senators. He found Pompey's camp filled with luxuries, silver plates, tables set for a victory feast, and tents draped in ivy. It was a stark contrast to the grueling life his own men had led. Caesar burnt Pompey's private correspondence without reading it, an act of intellectual relaxation and political theater designed to show that he was not interested in starting a new round of proscriptions. He pardoned several key figures who would later play major roles in his life, including Marcus Brutus. By doing so, he was attempting to heal the systemic rift in the Roman elite through an act of supreme confidence. The logic of the war had now shifted again. With the defeat at Pharsalus, the organized resistance of the Senate as a unified military force was over. However, the conflict was not yet finished. Pompey had fled to Egypt, and other leaders like Cato and Labienus were heading to Africa to raise new armies. Caesar realized that he had to capture Pompey to end the war's legitimacy once and for all. He set out in pursuit with a small force, moving through Asia Minor and toward the Nile Delta. He was no longer just a general fighting for his own survival. He was now the de facto ruler of the Roman world, pursuing the ghost of the old republic. At first glance, Pharsalus was the climax of the story, but from a systemic perspective, it was merely the point where the old republic's ability to defend itself was finally extinguished. The decision at the Rubicon had led Caesar through the snows of Italy, the gales of the Adriatic, and the dust of Thessaly. He had proven that a single, unified command backed by professional loyalty was superior to a fractured, aristocratic command backed by legal tradition. As the sun set on the field of Pharsalus, the bodies of thousands of Roman citizens lay as a testament to the failure of the old system to resolve its internal contradictions through anything other than the sword. The quiet observation that ends this part of the journey is the realization of the cost of Caesar's victory. He had won the right to return to Rome, but the Rome he would return to was fundamentally changed. The elite were decimated, the institutions were hollowed out, and the power of the individual had been permanently elevated above the power of the law. As Caesar prepared to enter Egypt, he was moving into a world where the old Roman rules mattered even less, and the personal will of the commander mattered even more. The long morning of war was moving toward a midday of absolute power, and the decisions Caesar had made at the riverbank were now shaping the map of the entire Mediterranean. One of the reasons the next chapter of his life in Egypt would be so different was the shift from Roman politics to global geopolitics. He was no longer just dealing with senators and tribunes. He was dealing with ancient monarchies and international trade routes. The crossing of the Rubicon had truly been a crossing into a new world. The calm, sincere reality of that change was now visible to everyone, from the veterans in the legions to the survivors of the senatorial camp. The die had not just been cast, it had landed, and the world it revealed was one that Caesar would now have to learn to govern alone. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in late 48 BC, he was not entering a city as a conqueror, but as a creditor and a judge. Egypt, though technically an independent kingdom, had become a systemic client state of Rome, bound by massive debts and strategic grain exports. At first glance, Caesar's arrival with only 2 small legions, about 4,000 men, seems like a tactical oversight for a man who had just won the greatest battle in Roman history. However, the problem with this situation was that Caesar believed the war was essentially over. He expected to find Pompey as a humble suppliant and the Egyptian court as a cooperative host. Instead, he was met by a grim logistical reality. Pompey had been murdered on the beach by the orders of the young King Ptolemy Roman 13 advisors, who hoped to win Caesar's favor by removing his rival. When Caesar was presented with Pompey's severed head, he reportedly turned away in grief, realizing that his enemy had been denied the dignity of Roman mercy. What matters here is that the death of Pompey did not simplify the situation. It complicated it by removing the singular focus of the war and entangling Caesar in a local dynastic struggle. Egypt was currently divided between Ptolemy Roman XIII and his sister, Cleopatra Roman VII. Caesar, occupying the royal palace in Alexandria, demanded that both siblings disband their armies and submit to his arbitration as per the will of their late father. One of the reasons Caesar chose to stay was purely financial. The Roman state was bankrupt after the Civil War, and the Egyptian crown owed the Caesar family a staggering sum of money from previous political deals. He could not leave without securing the funds necessary to pay his veterans. This was a decision driven by the constraints of Roman military finance rather than a desire for Egyptian adventure. The problem with Caesar's occupation of the palace was the growing hostility of the Alexandrian population and the king's professional army. The advisors of Ptolemy, led by the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, realized that Caesar's small force was vulnerable. They moved their army of 20,000 men into the city, effectively besieging Caesar within the royal quarter. This was a different kind of warfare than Caesar had faced in Gaul or at Pharsalus. It was urban combat, fought in narrow streets and on rooftops, where his superior infantry tactics were neutralized by the sheer density of the environment. Caesar was forced to burn the Egyptian fleet in the harbor to prevent it from being captured, a fire that famously spread to the docks and, according to some accounts, damaged the Great Library. One of the reasons the Alexandrian War became a legendary chapter in Caesar's life was the introduction of Cleopatra. Realizing that her brother's advisors intended to kill her, she famously smuggled herself into the palace inside a laundry bag or a carpet to meet with Caesar. While this is often framed as a romantic encounter, it was a high-stakes political negotiation between two brilliant tacticians. Cleopatra needed a Roman protector to regain her throne, and Caesar needed a reliable, intelligent ruler in Egypt who could ensure the steady flow of grain and gold to Rome. By siding with Cleopatra, Caesar was choosing a partner who understood the systemic importance of the Roman-Egyptian alliance. This decision, however, solidified the opposition of Ptolemy's faction and turned the siege into an all-out war for survival. During the winter months, Caesar was trapped in a state of fortified anxiety. He held the palace and the pharaoh's lighthouse, but he was cut off from fresh water and supplies. His soldiers were forced to dig wells in the sand, finding brackish but drinkable water, a feat of engineering that kept the small force alive. This period illustrates the physical limits of power. Even the master of the Roman world could be brought to the brink by a lack of basic logistics. Caesar's letters from this time reflect a man who was acutely aware of his mistake in entering a foreign capital with such a small force. He had to wait for reinforcements to arrive from Asia Minor and Syria, led by Mithridates of Pergamum, a diverse force of allied troops that represented the sprawling network of Roman influence in the East. By this point, the conflict had moved to the water. In a series of naval skirmishes in the Great Harbor, Caesar fought to maintain control of the sea lanes. In one famous incident, a sudden Egyptian attack on the mole connecting the city to the Pharaoh's island forced Caesar to jump into the sea to escape. He supposedly swam to safety while holding his personal papers above the water with one hand and his purple general's cloak in his teeth. This moment of individual vulnerability is a reminder that even the most calculated political moves can end in a desperate struggle for breath. It was only the arrival of Mithridates' army in early 47 BC that shifted the balance. Caesar slipped out of the city, joined forces with his allies, and defeated Ptolemy's army at the Battle of the Nile. The young king drowned in the river, leaving Cleopatra as the sole ruler of Egypt. One of the reasons Caesar lingered in Egypt for several months after the victory is often debated. It is often misunderstood as a simple vacation with Cleopatra, but it had a clear systemic purpose. He needed to ensure the stability of the new regime before he left. A chaotic Egypt meant a starving Rome. He took a famous journey up the Nile with Cleopatra, not just to see the monuments, but to demonstrate the power of the Roman-Egyptian alliance to the local population. By the time he left in the summer of 47 BC, he had established 3 Roman legions in Egypt to protect Cleopatra and to ensure she remained loyal to Roman interests. He had transformed a volatile civil war into a stable client monarchy, securing the southern flank of the Roman world. However, the problem with this situation was that while Caesar was in Egypt, the rest of the world was falling back into chaos. In Asia Minor, King Pharnaces Roman II of Pontus had taken advantage of the Roman civil war to reclaim his father's old territories, defeating a Roman legate and seizing control of key trade routes. Caesar realized that he could not return to Rome until he had reasserted authority in the east. He marched north with a speed that exceeded even his own previous records. The Zeller campaign lasted only 5 days from his arrival to the final battle. It was here that he famously sent the message back to the Senate, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. This was not just a boast. It was a psychological tool designed to remind the Senate that despite his long absence in Egypt, his military efficiency remained absolute. What matters here is the logistical state of the Republic, as Caesar finally prepared to return to Rome in late 47 BC. Italy was in a state of economic depression. The veteran soldiers who had been left behind were mutinying, demanding the land and bonuses Caesar had promised them years ago. In the Senate, the vacuum of leadership had led to a breakdown of civil order. Caesar landed at Tarentum and moved toward the capital, not with an army, but with the sheer force of his reputation. He met the mutinous 10th Legion outside the city walls. Instead of threatening them, he addressed them as citizens, Quirites, rather than soldiers, Camilitones. This subtle shift in vocabulary was a brilliant use of social pressure. By addressing them as civilians, he was implying they were already discharged and would miss out on the glory of his final campaigns. The soldiers, shocked and shamed, begged to be reinstated. One of the reasons this period was so difficult for Caesar was the realization that the war was still not over. While he had been in the East, the survivors of the Pompeian faction, led by Cato the Younger and Metellus Scipio, had assembled a massive force in Africa. They had the support of King Juba of Numidia and commanded 10 legions and a large fleet. This was the largest concentration of anti-Caesarian forces since Pharsalus. Caesar found himself in the same position he had been in at the Rubicon. He could not govern a peaceful state until he had eliminated the last of the military opposition. He set sail for Africa in late 47 BC, once again ignoring the winter weather and the lack of full supplies, driven by the logic that a quick, risky strike was better than a slow, safe defeat. The African campaign was a grueling war of position in a harsh, arid landscape. Caesar's forces were plagued by sandstorms and a lack of forage for their horses. The Pompeian commanders used their superior cavalry to harass Caesar's supply lines, avoiding a direct confrontation. It was a test of endurance and discipline. One of the reasons Caesar eventually won was his ability to exploit the internal divisions between the Roman commanders and their Numidian allies. At the Battle of Thapsus in early 46 BC, Caesar's soldiers, acting without his direct order, launched a ferocious charge that swept through the enemy lines. The result was a massacre. The Pompeian leaders, including Metellus Scipio and King Juba, took their own lives rather than face the humiliation of Caesar's pardon. The most significant casualty of the African War was Cato the Younger. Cato had held the city of Utica and, upon hearing of the defeat at Thapsus, committed suicide in a highly ritualized and stoic fashion. For Caesar, Cato's death was a profound political defeat. Cato had succeeded in turning himself into a martyr for the Republic, creating a moral legacy that Caesar's military victories could never quite erase. Caesar reportedly said, "Cato, I grudge you your death, as you would have grudged me the preservation of your life." He realized that while he could kill the men who fought him, he could not kill the idea of the Republic that Cato had come to represent. This was the point where the military victory began to clash with the long-term problem of political legitimacy. By this point, Caesar had been away from Rome for most of the previous 4 years. He returned in the summer of 46 BC to celebrate 4 consecutive triumphs for Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. These were the most lavish spectacles in Roman history. He distributed vast sums of money to the citizens and provided feasts for tens of thousands. This was the logic of the new order. Caesar was buying the loyalty of the masses while the Senate looked on in a mixture of awe and resentment. He was no longer just a general. He was the dictator re publici constituendi, the dictator for the reconstitution of the Republic. He began a flurry of administrative and legal reforms, including the reform of the calendar, which provided a more stable framework for the Roman year. The quiet observation that ends this part of the journey is the realization that Caesar had finally run out of enemies to fight, yet he had not yet found a way to rule. He was the master of the entire Mediterranean, from the Atlantic to the Nile, but he was trapped in a system that had no permanent place for him. He had crossed the Rubicon to save his career and his life, and in doing so, he had accidentally inherited the responsibility for an entire world. As he sat in the center of the triumphs, surrounded by the spoils of 4 continents, the calm, sincere reality of his position was becoming clear. He had destroyed the old world, but the new world he was building was held together by nothing more than the strength of his own personality. The final return of Julius Caesar to Rome in 46 BC marked the beginning of a period where the logic of military conquest was replaced by the logic of permanent administration. For nearly 15 years, Caesar had existed in a state of constant motion, moving from one crisis to the next. Now, for the first time since he had crossed the Rubicon, he faced a world where there were no more major armies left to oppose him. However, the systemic challenge he faced in the capital was perhaps more complex than any battlefield. He had to transform a temporary emergency powers structure into a stable government that could function without the constant threat of civil war. At first glance, his position was absolute, but the underlying problem was that the Roman political class, the senators and the aristocrats, still viewed him as an aberration rather than a solution. One of the reasons Caesar's final reforms were so sweeping was his realization that the old city-state institutions were fundamentally broken. He began by addressing the most immediate logistical issues facing the city of Rome itself. He reduced the number of people eligible for free grain from 320,000 to 150,000, not out of cruelty, but to stabilize the state's finances and reduce the incentive for the rural poor to flood into the already overcrowded capital. At the same time, he launched a massive program of colonization, sending nearly 80,000 landless citizens and veterans to new cities in Carthage, Corinth, and across Spain and Gaul. This was a sophisticated piece of social engineering. He was exporting the city's problems while simultaneously Romanizing the provinces and creating a loyal network of communities across the empire. What matters here is that Caesar was acting as a sovereign rather than a magistrate. He began to plan a total reorganization of the city's physical layout, commissioning the Forum Iulium, which featured a temple to Venus Genetrix, his divine ancestor. This was more than just a vanity project. It was a move to create a new center of power that was distinct from the traditional Republican Forum. He also initiated a census, reformed the penal code, and passed sumptuary laws to curb the extravagant spending of the elite. These actions were logically sound and aimed at restoring order, but they were implemented through personal edict rather than senatorial debate. To the traditionalists who remained in the Senate, Caesar was not reconstituting the Republic. He was burying it under a mountain of efficiency. One of the reasons the reform of the calendar stands out as his most enduring legacy is its sheer intellectual clarity. The old Roman lunar calendar was a mess, often manipulated by priests for political reasons to shorten or lengthen the years. By 46 BC, the calendar was 3 months out of alignment with the seasons. Caesar, utilizing the astronomical knowledge he had acquired in Egypt, introduced the Julian calendar, based on the solar year of 365.25 days. To fix the existing discrepancy, he made the year 46 BC the longest in history, 445 days, known as the Year of Confusion. This was a perfect example of his systemic approach to leadership. He identified a logical flaw in the state's operation and imposed a scientific, permanent solution that ignored tradition in favor of functionality. The problem with this situation was that as Caesar's administrative success grew, his political isolation deepened. In early 44 BC, he was appointed Dictator Perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. This was a legal oxymoron in the Roman system. The dictatorship was, by definition, a temporary office meant to handle a specific crisis. By making it permanent, Caesar was signaling that the emergency would never end, or rather, that the state could no longer function without his personal oversight. This was the moment the systemic reframe became irreversible. He was no longer a restorer, he was a monarch in all but name. He began wearing the high red boots of the ancient Alban kings and sat on a golden throne in the Senate, further alienating the very men he needed to help him govern. What matters here is the concept of incentives. For the younger senators, Caesar's permanent rule meant that the traditional path to glory, the cursus honorum, was now a dead end. Why bother competing for the consulship if the consul had no real power? For the older aristocrats, Caesar's behavior was a daily assault on their dignitas. This sense of disenfranchisement created a shared incentive among disparate groups to remove the man who had become a bottleneck for their ambitions. They didn't necessarily have a plan for what would come after. They simply wanted to remove the obstacle to the old system. This was the birth of the conspiracy, led by Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus. One of the reasons Brutus's involvement was so critical was his ancestral legacy. He was a descendant of the Brutus who had expelled the kings from Rome 500 years earlier. For the conspirators, Brutus was the moral shield they needed. If a man of his reputation believed Caesar had to die, then the act was not a murder, but a tyrannicide, a sacred duty to the state. Brutus was a man of deep intellectual convictions, and he struggled with the decision, as he was a personal friend of Caesar and had been treated with great kindness by him. However, the logic of the Republic, as he understood it, demanded the sacrifice of personal loyalty for the preservation of the law. He was persuaded that Caesar's mercy was actually a form of enslavement, as it made the citizens' lives dependent on the dictator's grace. By this point, the atmosphere in Rome was thick with rumors and omens. Caesar, however, seemed to ignore the danger. He had dismissed his personal bodyguard of Spanish soldiers, claiming that it was better to die once than to live in constant fear. From a logistical standpoint, he was already looking past the politics of the city toward a massive new military campaign. He was planning an invasion of the Parthian Empire to avenge the death of Crassus and to secure the eastern borders. He had already sent his legions ahead to Macedonia and was scheduled to leave the city on March 18th. The conspirators realized that if they didn't act before he left, he would be surrounded by his army for years, making him untouchable. The Ides of March 15th, became the hard deadline for their plot. One of the reasons the Senate met that day at the Theater of Pompey, rather than the usual Curia, was because the Senate House was being rebuilt as part of Caesar's forum projects. This was a bitter irony. Caesar would meet his end in a building named after his great rival. As he walked toward the meeting, he was approached by a man who tried to hand him a note warning of the conspiracy, but Caesar, distracted by the crowd, tucked it into his robe unread. He entered the hall and took his seat. The conspirators gathered around him under the pretext of presenting a petition. When the first blow was struck by Casca, Caesar initially fought back, but as he saw Brutus, his protege, among the attackers, he reportedly gave up the struggle, covering his head with his toga and falling at the base of Pompey's statue. The immediate aftermath of the assassination was not the restoration of the Republic, but a systemic vacuum of terrifying proportions. The conspirators ran into the streets shouting of liberty, but they were met with a stunned and silent population. They had removed the head of the state, but they had not replaced the body. One of the reasons their plan failed was their failure to account for Mark Antony. Antony, as the surviving consul, managed to secure Caesar's papers and his vast wealth. At Caesar's funeral, Antony delivered a masterful piece of political theater, reading Caesar's will, which left a significant sum of money to every Roman citizen, and displaying Caesar's blood-stained robe. The mood of the city shifted instantly from confusion to a violent desire for revenge. The problem with this situation was that the conspirators had relied on the idea that the system would simply take back over. They assumed that the Senate would resume its authority and the people would rejoice. But the system had changed. The Roman people no longer cared as much about the abstract liberty of the aristocrats as they did about the stability and the benefits that Caesar had provided. The rule of the sword that Caesar had introduced could not be undone by a few daggers. It had merely been made available to whoever could seize it next. Brutus and Cassius were forced to flee the city, realizing that they had won the battle, but were losing the war for the soul of Rome. What matters here is the appearance of the final player in this systemic drama, Octavian. As Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew and posthumously adopted heir, Octavian arrived in Italy with no military experience, but an incredible grasp of political logistics. He realized that the name Caesar was the most powerful asset in the world. He began to recruit Caesar's veterans, who were eager to avenge their commander and secure the land they had been promised. Octavian didn't wait for the Senate's permission. He simply started building a power base. This was the final logical conclusion of the path Caesar had started at the Rubicon. The state was now a legacy to be inherited, not a republic to be governed. One of the reasons this historical period is so compelling is the sense of inevitability. Caesar's decision at the Rubicon had broken the old world so thoroughly that even his death could not fix it. He had shown that the republic was a sham, a mere name without body or form. His death only accelerated the transition to a more permanent and professionalized form of autocracy. The long night at the Rubicon had indeed led to a world of misery for the old elite, but it had also laid the groundwork for the centuries of relative stability that would become the Roman Empire. Caesar was the catalyst who converted a failing system into a durable, if less free, alternative. The quiet observation that ends our look at Caesar's decision is the realization that he was a man who lived and died by his ability to see the world as it was, rather than as he wished it to be. He saw that the Republic was dead long before he crossed the river, and he had the courage or the ambition to act on that knowledge. He was the steady, intelligent person of his age, explaining through his actions that the old constraints could no longer hold the weight of the Roman world. As he lay at the foot of Pompey's statue, the logic of his life reached its final, silent conclusion. The die had been cast, the game had been played, and the world was now left to deal with the results. The vacuum left by the assassination of Julius Caesar was not a space of liberty, but a high-pressure zone of systemic instability. In the hours following the Ides of March, the city of Rome existed in a state of suspended animation. At first glance, the conspirators, who called themselves the liberators, believed that the mere removal of the tyrant would allow the Republic's ancient heart to beat again. However, the problem with this situation was that they had performed a surgical strike on a person without addressing the underlying anatomy of the state. The Senate, the people, and the army were no longer separate entities governed by law. They were a complex, interlocking system that had become dependent on a single central authority. When that authority was violently removed, the system did not revert to its old settings. It began to vibrate with the threat of total collapse. What matters here is the logistical advantage held by Mark Antony in the immediate aftermath. As the surviving consul and Caesar's primary lieutenant, Antony was the only individual with the legal standing to convene the Senate and the practical means to maintain order. While the liberators barricaded themselves on the Capitoline Hill, fearing a popular uprising, Antony was quietly securing Caesar's personal papers and his massive private treasury, which was stored in the Temple of Ops. This was a classic move of administrative capture. By controlling the documentation and the money, Antony ensured that he was the only person who could decipher Caesar's future plans and fulfill his promises to the veterans. The Republic was a collection of laws, but the new order was a collection of ledgers, and Antony held the keys. One of the reasons the Compromise of March 17th was so significant was its inherent logical contradiction. In a meeting held at the Temple of Tellus, the Senate, led by the mediating voice of Cicero, struck a bargain. Caesar's assassins would receive amnesty, but all of Caesar's acts and decrees, even those not yet implemented, would be upheld. This was a systemic paradox. If Caesar was a tyrant who deserved to die, his acts should have been void. If his acts were valid, his murder was a crime. The Senate chose this middle path because it was the only way to prevent an immediate civil war. Many senators held offices or were promised governorships under Caesar's future plans. To invalidate his acts was to strip themselves of their own power. This highlights a central theme of the late Republic. The personal incentives of the elite had become completely detached from the moral consistency of the law. The funeral of Caesar was the moment this fragile compromise disintegrated. From a purely functional standpoint, a funeral was a ritual for the dead, but in the hands of a skilled rhetorician like Mark Antony, it became a weapon for the living. Antony did not deliver a standard eulogy. He conducted a piece of mass psychological theater. By reading Caesar's will aloud, revealing that the dictator had left his vast private gardens to the public and a significant sum of money to every citizen, Antony shifted the crowd's perception of Caesar from a master to a benefactor. When he displayed the blood-stained toga, riddled with dagger marks, the city's mood shifted from mourning to a violent desire for revenge. This was a systemic failure of the liberators' strategy. They had prioritized the liberty of the Senate, while the people prioritized the security and generosity of the individual. The problem with the liberators' position was their failure to account for the professionalized army. There were nearly 40 legions of veteran soldiers scattered across the empire, and their primary loyalty was not to the Republic as an abstract idea, but to the memory and the estate of the man who had led them to victory in Gaul and civil war. When word of the assassination reached the camps, the soldiers did not celebrate the return of the Senate. They waited to see who would pay them their promised bonuses. This was the logistical reality that rendered the conspirators' dreams of a restored republic obsolete. Power had moved from the forum to the barracks, and no amount of traditionalist rhetoric could bring it back. The sword had been drawn at the Rubicon, and it remained the only currency that mattered. By this point, a new variable entered the systemic equation: the arrival of Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew. When Octavius landed in Italy in April, he learned that Caesar had posthumously adopted him as his son and heir. At first glance, a teenager with no military experience seemed like a minor player in a game dominated by giants like Antony and Brutus. However, the logic of Roman social structure made Octavius, now calling himself Caesar Octavianus, the most dangerous person in the world. He understood that, in the Roman mind, the name Caesar carried a quasi-religious weight. By accepting the adoption, he wasn't just inheriting property, he was inheriting the personal loyalty of millions. He began to recruit his father's veterans, using his own inheritance to pay them, effectively building a private army before he even held a single public office. One of the reasons the relationship between Antony and Octavian was so volatile was their competition for the same resource, the Caesarian legacy. Antony viewed the boy as a useful mascot who could be easily marginalized. Octavian viewed Antony as a corrupt executor who was mishandling his father's estate. This friction created a three-way deadlock between the Caesarians, the liberators, and the traditionalist Senate led by Cicero. Cicero saw in the young Octavian a tool to be used against Antony. He believed he could mentor the boy, using his private army to protect the Senate, and then discard him once the threat was neutralized. This was a catastrophic miscalculation of Octavian's character, and a failure to understand that the youth had already grasped the new rules of power far better than the elder statesman had. What matters here is the shift in the theater of war. Realizing that the city of Rome was no longer safe or productive for them, Brutus and Cassius left for the east to take control of the wealthy provinces of Macedonia, Syria, and Asia Minor. This was a strategic move to build a massive resource base, mimicking the logistical strategy Pompey had used years earlier. They began to raise a republican army funded by the heavy taxation of the eastern cities. Meanwhile, Antony moved into northern Italy to seize the province of Cisalpine Gaul from its current governor, Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators. The state was once again fragmenting into a series of personal fiefdoms, each governed by a commander who operated outside the traditional chains of command. The law had become a series of footnotes to the movements of legions. The problem with this fragmentation was that it made any kind of peaceful governance impossible. Throughout late 44 and early 43 BC, the Senate, under Cicero's influence, declared Antony a public enemy and legitimized Octavian's private army to go and fight him. This led to the Battle of Mutina, a brutal conflict in northern Italy. While the senatorial forces won and Antony was forced to retreat toward Gaul, both of the consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, were killed in the fighting. This left Octavian in sole command of the victorious legions. At 19 years old, he had achieved through a stroke of luck and cold-blooded opportunism what his father had achieved through decades of war. He was the master of a veteran army with no legal superior left in Italy. By this point, Octavian realized that his interests aligned more closely with Antony than with the Senate. The Senate had already begun to snub him, refusing him the consulship because of his age and attempting to transfer his troops to other commanders. The logic of survival took over. Octavian marched his legions on Rome, repeating his father's gesture at the Rubicon, and forced the state to appoint him consul. He then reached out to Antony and another Caesarian general, Lepidus, to form a formal alliance. This was the birth of the second triumvirate. Unlike the first, which was a secret handshake, this was a legally sanctioned board of 3 men with consular power for the reconstitution of the state. They did not ask for power, they seized it and then ordered the lawyers to write it down. One of the reasons the second triumvirate was so much more brutal than Caesar's dictatorship was the need for total systemic security. Caesar had tried clementia, and it had led to his death. The triumvirs decided on a different path, the proscriptions. They posted lists of their enemies in the forum, offering rewards for their heads and confiscating their property. This was a dual-purpose logistical operation. It removed anyone who might lead a future conspiracy, and it provided the massive funds needed to pay their 45 legions. Among the first names on the list, insisted upon by Antony, was Cicero. The man who had tried to save the Republic through oratory was silenced by the same military logic he had tried to manipulate. His head and hands were displayed on the rostra, marking the definitive end of the Republic's intellectual life. What matters here is the finality of the transition. By the end of 43 BC, the Roman state was no longer an arena for competing political ideas. It was a military corporation with 3 shareholders. The long night at the Rubicon had matured into a permanent winter of autocracy. The liberators in the east, Brutus and Cassius, were now the only remaining obstacle to the triumvirs' total control. The world was divided into 2 camps, each preparing for a massive clash that would decide not the fate of the Republic, but the ownership of the empire. The institutions of Rome, the assemblies, the courts, the voting centuries, still existed in name, but they had become hollow shells, used only to ratify the decisions made in the tents of the generals. The quiet observation that ends this part of the story is the total loss of agency for the average Roman citizen. Decisions that affected the lives of millions across 3 continents were now being made by 3 men over a map on a table. The habit of the mind, that was the Republic, the belief that power must be shared and debated, had been broken by the efficiency of the sword. Caesar had been the one to strike the first blow at the river, but his successors were the ones who ensured the wound would never heal. As the triumvirs prepared to cross into Greece to hunt down the last of the Republicans, the calm, sincere reality of the New World was one of cold, calculated force. One of the reasons the next stage of the war, the Battle of Philippi, would be so decisive was that it was the final encounter between the old world of the Senate and the new world of the commanders. It was not just a battle of men, but a battle of systems. The liberators fought for a past that was already gone. The triumvirs fought for a future they were already building. The logic of Caesar's decision had created a momentum that could no longer be stopped. The die had been cast, and now it was rolling toward its final, inevitable resting place in the dust of Macedonia. The year 42 BC served as the final logistical funnel for the remnants of the Roman Republic, condensing centuries of political tradition into a single military confrontation on the plains of Macedonia. At first glance, the struggle between the Second Triumvirate and the liberators appears as a simple war of revenge for the death of Julius Caesar. However, the problem with this situation was that it represented a profound systemic mismatch. Brutus and Cassius, stationed in the east, were attempting to defend a government of laws using the very tools of personal military command that had destroyed those laws in the first place. They had spent the previous year systematically plundering the cities of Asia Minor and Greece to fund an army that was republican in name, but entirely professional in its incentives. This created a tension within their camp. They were fighting for the freedom of a Senate that was currently being purged in Rome, leading an army that fought primarily for the gold they extracted from the provinces. What matters here is the sheer scale of the mobilization required for the Battle of Philippi. This was not a skirmish between rival factions. It was the largest gathering of Roman military force in the history of the state. The triumvirs, Octavian and Mark Antony, moved 28 legions across the Adriatic Sea, a feat of naval logistics that defied the blockade attempted by the Republican fleet. One of the reasons they were successful was the divided focus of the liberators. While Brutus and Cassius had a superior naval position, they allowed the triumviral transports to slip through, assuming that the sheer lack of supplies on the Macedonian coast would eventually starve the invaders. This was a decision driven by a passive strategic logic, whereas Antony and Octavian were driven by a desperate, active necessity. They had no money left in Italy and no political future unless they won a decisive victory immediately. The landscape of Philippi itself was a study in defensive constraints. The Republican army occupied a pair of hills overlooking the Via Egnatia, the main road connecting the east and west. They were anchored by marshes to the south and steep mountains to the north, creating a position that was nearly impossible to assault. Brutus and Cassius intended to sit behind their fortifications and wait for the triumvirs' supplies to fail. This was a logically sound strategy for a defensive war, but it failed to account for the psychological pressure of the professionalized legions. Soldiers who have been promised the wealth of the world do not wait patiently behind walls while their enemies taunt them in the open field. The triumvirs, particularly Antony, spent weeks building a network of causeways through the marshes to outflank the Republican position, forcing a confrontation that the liberators had hoped to avoid. One of the reasons the First Battle of Philippi, fought in early October, was so chaotic was the breakdown of command and control. Because the armies were so large, nearly 200,000 men in total, the battle essentially split into two separate engagements. Brutus, on the Republican right, successfully overran Octavian's camp, nearly capturing the young Caesar, who was reportedly ill in his tent. However, on the other side of the field, Antony's veterans managed to storm Cassius's fortifications. Due to a tragic failure in communication, a recurring systemic problem in ancient warfare, Cassius believed that Brutus had also been defeated. Distraught and seeing no path forward for the cause of the Republic, Cassius ordered his freedmen to kill him. This was a turning point. The Republicans had technically won half the battle, but they had lost their most experienced military organizer. The problem with this situation was that Brutus was now in sole command of a massive, restless army. Brutus was a philosopher and a statesman, but he lacked the general's touch that Antony possessed. He attempted to return to the original strategy of attrition, hoping to starve out the triumvirs as winter approached. But the logic of the camp worked against him. His soldiers, emboldened by their success against Octavian's wing, demanded a final, decisive fight. They saw the triumviral legions across the plain as a collection of starving men who were ripe for the taking. Brutus, fearing a mass desertion to the Caesarian side, eventually yielded to the pressure of his own men. This is a recurring theme in the collapse of the Republic. The commanders were often captives of the very armies they claimed to lead. The Second Battle of Philippi, fought 3 weeks later, was a brutal, head-on collision of infantry. There were no clever maneuvers or grand flanking actions. It was a test of which system of discipline could endure the most trauma. Antony's veterans, who had spent a decade in Gaul and Spain, possessed a level of battle hardness that the newly raised Republican legions could not match. When the line finally broke, it wasn't just a tactical failure. It was a systemic collapse of the Republican idea as a military force. Brutus, realizing that the dream of a restored Senate was dead, committed suicide. His death marked the final end of the liberators as a political entity. The men who had killed Caesar to save the Republic had succeeded only in creating a world where they had no place left to live. What matters here is the immediate redistribution of the world that followed the victory. Antony and Octavian met in their camp to divide the spoils of the empire, a process that was entirely detached from any constitutional authority. This was the logic of the two masters. Antony, as the primary architect of the victory at Philippi, took the wealthy and prestigious East. He intended to reorganize the provinces, settle the massive debts of the state, and eventually launch a campaign against the Parthians to complete Caesar's unfinished business. Octavian, who had performed poorly on the battlefield but held the crucial name of Caesar, was given the difficult and unpopular task of returning to Italy to settle the veterans on land confiscated from Italian towns. This was a classic administrative trade-off. Antony took the glory and the gold, while Octavian took the political minefield of the homeland. One of the reasons the return to Italy was so volatile was the logistical nightmare of land confiscation. To fulfill the promises made to the legions, Octavian had to evict thousands of Italian farmers from 18 of the most fertile cities in the peninsula. This created a systemic crisis of internal security. The poet Virgil, who lost his family farm during this period, famously captured the sense of displacement and misery that followed. Octavian found himself besieged by the protests of the evicted citizens and the demands of the restless soldiers. This was the quiet morning of his power, a period where he had to act as a ruthless bureaucrat to prevent the very army that gave him power from tearing Italy apart. He was learning that ruling a country was a matter of managing competing grievances rather than delivering inspiring speeches. By this point, the relationship between Octavian and Antony's family in Rome had reached a breaking point. Antony's wife, Fulvia, and his brother, Lucius Antonius, attempted to exploit the unrest in Italy to undermine Octavian's position. They positioned themselves as the champions of the evicted farmers, hoping to spark a popular uprising that would force Octavian out. This led to the Perusine War in 41 BC, a sharp, bitter conflict that ended with the siege and surrender of the city of Perusia. Octavian's handling of the situation was cold and calculated. He spared Lucius Antonius for political reasons, but reportedly executed hundreds of local aristocrats. This was a signal to the Roman world that the young Caesar had moved past the mercy of his father and was now operating on a logic of absolute, unquestioned control. The problem with this situation was that it nearly led to a premature war between the two triumvirs. When Antony returned to Italy in 40 BC to investigate the conflict, his fleet was initially blocked by Octavian's commanders. However, the soldiers on both sides refused to fight. They realized that their interests were best served by a unified triumvirate that could continue to provide them with land and pay. This soldiers' peace forced the two leaders to the negotiating table at Brundisium. They reached a new agreement. Antony would keep the east, Octavian would keep the west, and Lepidus would remain in Africa. To cement this alliance, Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia. This was a systemic attempt to stabilize the world through a dynastic marriage, a traditional tool of monarchies that the Republic had once found abhorrent. One of the reasons this period feels so grounded is the shift in Antony's focus toward Egypt. While Octavian was struggling with the logistics of Italy, Antony had met Cleopatra in Tarsus. This meeting is often framed as a romantic seduction, but from a systemic perspective, it was a high-stakes meeting of two heads of state. Cleopatra needed Roman military protection to secure her throne and her son's inheritance. Antony needed the vast wealth and grain supplies of Egypt to fund his planned Parthian war. Egypt was the only major Mediterranean power that remained outside the direct administrative control of Rome, making it a crucial logistical pivot point. By aligning himself with Cleopatra, Antony was building an independent power base that was increasingly detached from the Senate in Rome. What matters here is the growing divergence in the branding of the two leaders. Octavian, remaining in Rome, began to frame himself as the defender of traditional Italian values and the restorer of order. He worked with his friend Agrippa to repair the city's sewers and aqueducts, addressing the practical needs of the urban population. Antony, meanwhile, was increasingly seen as an Eastern figure, adopting the trappings of a Hellenistic god-king. This was an intellectual relaxation that Octavian would later exploit to his advantage. He would argue that Antony had been bewitched by a foreign queen and had forgotten his Roman identity. The struggle for the empire was moving from the battlefield of the legions to the battlefield of cultural perception. One of the reasons the next decade would be so critical was the final removal of the Republic as a viable alternative. With Brutus and Cassius gone, there was no longer a major faction fighting for the old system of shared power. The choice for every Roman, from the highest senator to the lowest farmer, was simply which master they preferred. The long night at the Rubicon had indeed produced a world where the law was a dead letter, and the only reality was the will of the triumvirate. As Octavian consolidated his grip on Italy and Antony prepared his grand campaign in the East, the calm, sincere reality of the Roman world was one of two rival suns, both rising toward an inevitable final collision. The quiet observation that ends this part of the journey is the realization that the liberators had failed precisely because they underestimated the structural changes Caesar had introduced. They thought they could kill the man and save the office, but the office of the commander had already superseded the office of the consul. By the end of 42 BC, the Republic was a ghost that haunted the Roman mind, but the empire was a body that was already beginning to breathe. The logic of the sword had been vindicated at Philippi, and the world was now left to wait and see which of the two victors would be the one to finally sheath it. The decade following the victory at Philippi was a period of systemic cooling, as the Roman world settled into a bifurcated reality governed by two men with increasingly divergent philosophies of power. At first glance, the division of the empire between Octavian in the west and Mark Antony in the east seemed like a logical way to manage the vast logistical challenges of the Mediterranean. However, the problem with this situation was that the Roman state was designed for a single, unified source of authority. Two masters meant two centers of gravity, two administrative styles, and eventually, two conflicting definitions of what it meant to be Roman. While Octavian spent these years deeply embedded in the traditionalist environment of Italy, Mark Antony was becoming the center of a Hellenistic court in Alexandria. This geographic separation created an intellectual rift that no diplomatic marriage or political treaty could permanently bridge. What matters here is how Octavian used his time in the West to transform his reputation from a ruthless triumvir into a stabilizing statesman. One of the reasons he was successful was his partnership with Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, a man of exceptional military and engineering talent. While Octavian handled the delicate politics of the Senate, Agrippa took charge of the physical logistics of the state. He cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, most notably defeating Sextus Pompeius in 36 BC, which finally secured the grain supply to Rome. He also embarked on a massive public works program, repairing ancient aqueducts and building the first Pantheon. This was a sophisticated use of soft power. By improving the daily lives of the citizens, Octavian was building a base of legitimacy that was not dependent on the memory of his father, but on his own competence as a protector of the people. The problem with this situation for Mark Antony was that his successes in the East were increasingly viewed through the lens of Roman suspicion. Antony had launched a massive campaign against the Parthian Empire in 36 BC, seeking to fulfill Caesar's old ambition and secure the eastern border. From a logistical standpoint, it was a disaster. Antony lost nearly a quarter of his army to the harsh terrain and the relentless guerrilla tactics of the Parthian horse archers. When he returned to Egypt, he turned to Cleopatra for financial and military support to rebuild his forces. This dependence on a foreign queen provided Octavian with the perfect rhetorical weapon. He began a systematic propaganda campaign in Rome, painting Antony as a man who had lost his Roman soul and was planning to move the capital of the world from the Tiber to the Nile. By this point, the systemic reframe of the conflict was nearly complete. Octavian was no longer fighting a rival general. He was framing himself as the defender of Italy against an Oriental threat. One of the reasons this was so effective was the reading of Antony's private will in the Senate in 32 BC. Octavian had seized the document from the Temple of the Vestal Virgins, a move that was legally questionable but politically brilliant. In the will, Antony requested to be buried in Alexandria alongside Cleopatra and left significant Roman territories to their children. This was the final proof Octavian needed to convince the Senate that Antony was no longer a Roman citizen, but a tool of a foreign monarchy. The logic of the war shifted from a civil struggle between two men to a patriotic crusade for national survival. One of the reasons the Battle of Actium in 31 BC became the final punctuation mark of the Civil War era was its nature as a conflict of exhaustion. The Mediterranean world had been in a state of near-constant mobilization since the Rubicon, and the appetite for a prolonged land war was gone. Antony and Cleopatra had assembled a massive fleet and army at Actium, on the coast of Greece, intending to invade Italy. However, Agrippa's naval tactics, specifically his use of a blockade to cut off Antony's supplies, forced the Eastern forces into a state of paralysis. For months, the two armies stared at each other across the water. The logic of the standoff was simple. Antony could not move forward without a fleet victory, and Octavian did not need to attack as long as the blockade held. What matters here is the psychological breakdown of Antony's camp. As the blockade continued, malaria and hunger began to decimate his troops. Many of his Roman officers, disgusted by Cleopatra's influence and sensing a change in the wind, began to desert to Octavian. This was a systemic failure of loyalty. In a professionalized army, soldiers follow the commander who can promise a future. Octavian represented a stable Italian future. Antony represented an uncertain Egyptian one. When the naval battle finally occurred on September 2nd, it was less a grand clash of empires and more a desperate attempt at a breakout. When Cleopatra's squadron fled toward Egypt in the middle of the fighting, Antony followed her, leaving his fleet and his land army to fend for themselves. This was the final abandonment of his Roman command. The problem with the aftermath of Actium was the final, tragic resolution of the two masters. Caesar had followed Pompey to Egypt years earlier, and now Octavian followed Antony. In 30 BC, Octavian's forces closed in on Alexandria. Antony, hearing a false report that Cleopatra was dead, took his own life. Cleopatra, realizing that Octavian intended to lead her in a humiliating triumph in Rome, followed suit, allegedly using the venom of an asp. With their deaths, the last independent power in the Mediterranean was extinguished. Egypt became a private province of the Roman Emperor, its vast wealth and grain supplies now fueling the administrative machinery of the new regime. Octavian was left as the sole master of the entire world, a position he would hold for the next 44 years. One of the reasons this transition feels so grounded is Octavian's refusal to call himself a king. He had learned from his father's mistakes. He knew that the Roman soul still clung to the language of the Republic, even if the reality was gone. In 27 BC, he famously restored the Republic to the Senate and the people. This was a masterpiece of political theater. In exchange for this symbolic gesture, the Senate granted him the title Augustus and a set of powers that allowed him to control the army and the provinces from behind the scenes. He became the princeps, or first citizen. This was the birth of the Principate, a system that provided the order of a monarchy with the dignity of a republic. The long night that had begun at the Rubicon had finally ended in the quiet, stable dawn of the Pax Romana. The logic of this new world was one of administrative permanence. Augustus realized that the Republic had failed because its institutions could not handle the scale of an empire. He replaced the chaotic competition of the aristocrats with a professionalized bureaucracy. He created a standing army with fixed terms of service and a dedicated pension fund, ensuring that the soldiers' loyalty was to the state rather than to individual generals. He also established the Praetorian Guard, a permanent military presence in Italy to ensure internal security. These were the hard logistics of the empire. By removing the incentives for civil war, Augustus provided the Roman world with a level of stability it had not known for a century. What matters here is the intellectual relaxation of the Augustan age. With the war over, the Roman elite could turn their attention to culture, law, and philosophy. This was the era of Virgil, Horace, and Livy, the golden age of Latin literature. These writers were not merely entertainers, they were the creators of a new national narrative. They wove the story of Augustus into the ancient myths of Rome, making the new empire feel like the inevitable fulfillment of Roman destiny. The memory of the bloody civil wars was gradually replaced by a vision of a world united under the rule of law and the peace of Augustus. The individual had been subordinated to the state, and the state was now personified by one man. One of the reasons this part of the story concludes here is that the systemic transformation of the Roman world was now complete. The decision at the Rubicon had set in motion a process that had stripped away the old, failing structures of the city-state and replaced them with the durable, professionalized structures of the empire. Caesar had been the architect of the destruction. Augustus was the architect of the reconstruction. The long night had indeed been a period of misery, but it had also been a period of profound creative evolution. The Mediterranean was now a single, integrated economic and political unit, a reality that would define the history of the Western world for the next 500 years. The quiet observation that ends this part of the journey is the realization of the price of peace. To achieve the stability of the Augustan age, the Roman people had to surrender their active political life. The Forum was no longer a place where the fate of the world was decided through debate. It was a place of monuments and ceremonies. The habit of the mind, that was the Republic, had been traded for the habit of the soul, that was the empire. As Augustus sat in his modest house on the Palatine Hill, he was not just a ruler, he was the symbol of a world that had finally chosen order over liberty. The calm, sincere reality of the new Roman world was one of quiet obedience and immense professional efficiency. The final stabilization of the Roman world under Augustus represents the systemic conclusion of the trajectory launched on that winter night at the Rubicon. While Julius Caesar had been the catalyst who broke the old world, it was his successor who drafted the final blueprints for the new one. At first glance, the transition from a republic to an empire might look like a sudden collapse, but it is better understood as a slow, deliberate professionalization of the state's most critical functions. By the end of Augustus's long reign in 14 AD, the decision made by Caesar had evolved from a desperate military gamble into a permanent administrative reality. The Roman system had effectively traded its volatile, high-participation political culture for a stable, low-friction bureaucracy that could sustain an empire for centuries. This shift was not merely about one man taking power, it was about the state finally aligning its governance with the logistical requirements of its vast territories. One of the reasons this new system was so durable was its focus on the hard logistics of power. In the old Republic, the army had been a collection of citizen soldiers whose loyalty was fragmented between various competing aristocrats. Augustus replaced this with a standing, professional army of 28 legions, where every soldier's term of service, pay, and retirement was guaranteed by the state treasury. He created the Aerarium Militare, a dedicated military fund financed by inheritance taxes, ensuring that no future general could easily buy the loyalty of his troops with personal wealth. This moved the monopoly of force from the individual to the office of the princeps. The rule of the sword was not abolished. It was simply institutionalized and hidden behind the curtain of civil administration, providing a safety that the chaotic republic could never guarantee. What matters here is how the concept of the citizen was reframed during this final transition. In Cicero's day, being a citizen meant active participation in the forum, voting in the assemblies, and perhaps serving as a juror or a magistrate. In the Augustan world, the citizen became a subject client. The rights of the individual were replaced by the benefits provided by the state, the annona, the grain supply, the congiaria, cash gifts, and the ludi, the games. This was a cynical but logically sound trade-off. Most Romans were far more concerned with the reliable arrival of grain ships from Egypt than they were with the fine points of senatorial debate. By meeting these basic needs with unprecedented efficiency, the imperial system removed the primary incentives for the kind of populist unrest that had fueled the rise of men like Catiline or Clodius. The problem with this situation was the slow atrophy of the Roman political mind. With the significant decisions now being made in the private chambers of the Palatine Hill, the Senate became a school for etiquette and tradition rather than a chamber of governance. The intense, logic-driven oratory that had defined the late Republic was replaced by the panegyric, speeches of praise for the emperor. This was the intellectual relaxation of the empire in its most literal sense. The public no longer needed to understand the complexities of the state because the state was no longer their responsibility. The decision at the Rubicon had effectively retired the Roman people from the business of ruling themselves. While this brought a long-desired peace, it also created a systemic vulnerability. The entire world was now dependent on the character and competence of a single individual. One of the reasons the Augustan system is often called the Principate is its clever use of psychological theater. Augustus never used the titles of a king or a dictator. He preferred the title princeps, which simply meant first citizen. He lived in a relatively modest house, walked the streets like a private individual, and always appeared to be deferential to the Senate. This was a form of cultural logistics designed to lower the prestige cost of the new regime for the old elite. By allowing the aristocrats to keep their togas, their titles, and their social standing, Augustus prevented the kind of deep-seated resentment that had led to his father's assassination. He understood that the image of authority was often more important than the title of authority. He governed through a soft autocracy that allowed the republic to die with its dignity seemingly intact. What matters here is the long-term legacy of the Roman administrative machine. The professionalized civil service that Augustus built became the standard for every major state that followed in Western history. He created the first permanent fire brigade, the first urban police force, the vigiles, and a sophisticated postal system, the cursus publicus, that allowed information to travel at the speed of a horse across 3 continents. These were the connective tissues of the empire. By ensuring that a merchant in Spain could reliably trade with a farmer in Syria under the protection of the same laws and the same currency, the empire created a level of economic integration that would not be seen again in Europe until the 20th century. The decision had converted the Mediterranean from a battlefield into a single, massive marketplace. One of the reasons the Roman law remained so influential, even after the political power of Rome faded, was its focus on clarity and predictability. The imperial jurists, working under the patronage of the emperors, began to codify the ancient laws into a systematic framework. They moved away from the oral traditions and the religious rituals of the early republic toward a natural law based on reason. This provided a common legal language for a diverse empire of millions. Whether you were a Greek, a Gaul, or an Egyptian, you could understand your rights and obligations within a consistent system. This was the ultimate victory of the rule of law, ironically achieved under the rule of an autocrat. The logic of the system had outlived the freedom of the people who created it. The problem with the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was that it was built on a foundation of absolute military dominance and the exploitation of the provinces. While the interior of the empire enjoyed a level of safety that was unprecedented, the borders were sites of constant, grinding conflict. The systemic requirement for land and resources to pay the legions meant that the empire had to remain in a state of perpetual stabilization. The long night at the Rubicon had not ended the war. It had simply pushed the war to the frontiers. The Roman world was like a massive fortress, peaceful inside its walls, but forever staring out at a world it could not fully conquer or understand. This tension would eventually become the primary constraint that would lead to the empire's final decline centuries later. At first glance, Julius Caesar is the hero or the villain of this story, but from a systemic perspective, he was merely the one who triggered a change that was already inevitable. The Republic was a system designed for a small town that had accidentally inherited the world. It was being crushed by its own success. The decision at the river was the point where the weight of that empire finally broke the old city-state frame. Caesar was the man who had the clarity to see the break and the ambition to step through it. His life and death were the growing pains of a civilization transitioning from a collection of competing families into a global administrative power. He was the catalyst for a world that required a different kind of order to survive. One of the reasons this narration is so focused on the calm, sincere reality of these changes is to show that history is not just a series of dramatic events, but a series of solutions to practical problems. The Roman Empire was a solution to the problem of civil war. The professional army was a solution to the problem of political generals. The Julian calendar was a solution to the problem of time itself. By looking at history through the lens of these systems and incentives, we can see that even the most violent shifts are often driven by a desire for stability and predictability. Caesar's decision was a moment of supreme chaos, but its ultimate goal and its ultimate result was the creation of a world that could finally sleep in peace. The quiet observation that ends our look at the Rubicon is the realization that the die Caesar cast is still rolling. Every time a modern state debates the balance between executive power and legislative authority, every time a military becomes professionalized and detached from politics, and every time a society trades some of its participation for the promise of security, we are seeing the echoes of 49 BC. Caesar's choice was the prototype for the modern state. He showed that in a complex, globalized world, the habit of the mind must sometimes yield to the habit of the office. He was the first to navigate the transition into the world we now inhabit, a world where the structures of power are often more important than the individuals who occupy them. By this point, the story of the Rubicon has become the story of ourselves. We are the heirs to the Augustan peace, living in a world of professional administration and global logistics. We value the rule of law and the stability of the state precisely because we know the alternative is the chaos that Caesar faced at the riverbank. The long night of the civil wars serves as a reminder of what happens when the institutions of a society can no longer contain the pressures of its own growth. In the calm of our modern night, the memory of Caesar's decision provides a sense of orientation, a way of understanding the delicate balance between the freedom we desire and the order we require. The final note of this history is one of quiet, intellectual relaxation. The Roman world did not end at the Rubicon. It began a new, much longer chapter. The city of Rome still stands, the laws are still studied, and the calendar still marks our days. The systemic shift that Caesar initiated has proven to be one of the most durable transformations in human history. As the sun set on the Republic and rose on the Empire, the world learned that even in the face of total collapse, a new and different kind of life is possible. The logic of the sword had been sheathed, the logic of the toga had been refined, and the long, slow work of civilization continued on, just as it always does. The story of the decision at the Rubicon is the story of the birth of the modern world from the ashes of the ancient one. It is a story of constraints, incentives, and the relentless pursuit of order. And as the lights of the Roman Forum fade into the distance of history, we are left with the image of a man who looked at a shallow stream and saw the future of an entire civilization. He stepped into the water, and the world followed him,